You've got 30 days to relocate your livestock situation, or we'll have you forcibly removed. I'm standing on the porch of my grandfather's ranch land that's been in my family since 1952, staring at this woman who moved here 6 months ago and thinks she can evict me from my own property. Karen Whitfield clutches her clipboard like it's the Constitution itself, her bleached blonde hair shellacked into place despite the Texas wind trying its best to mess it up. The morning air carries the honest smell of cattle and fresh-cut hay, but it's getting contaminated by whatever Bath and Body Works explosion she marinated herself in this morning. I'm talking industrial-strength vanilla that could probably kill mosquitoes at 50 yards. This isn't just about some HOA complaint. This is about a 40-acre ranch with oil rights that some developer wants, and Karen here thinks she's found herself a pushover. "Ma'am," I say, keeping my voice level, "you do realize this is my private property, right?" Her laugh could curdle milk. "Not for long, sweetie." What would you do if some newcomer tried to steal your family's legacy? Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has nightmare stories too. Little did Karen know, she'd just started a war with the guy who spent 15 years writing federal HOA regulations. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name's Garrett Stone, and 6 months ago I was living the Washington, D.C. Dream Senior Policy Advisor at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, making 6 figures writing regulations that govern homeowner associations across America. 15 years of bureaucratic battles, congressional hearings, and enough coffee to power a small city. Then Grandpa Joe passed away and left me the Lazy G Ranch in Cedar Falls, Texas. Population 8,400 on a good day, where everyone knows your business before you do, and the local diner still serves coffee strong enough to wake the dead. This place has been in our family since Grandpa bought it fresh out of Korea in 1952. 40 acres of prime Texas land, with mineral rights that oil companies have been circling like vultures for decades. I traded my government cubicle for a wraparound porch where morning coffee tastes like freedom and the sunrise turns everything golden. The sound of cattle lowing mixed with meadowlarks singing beats DC traffic any day of the week. Walking out to check fence lines at dawn, my boots crunch on the same gravel path Grandpa walked for 70 years, and the air carries that perfect mix of sage, mesquite, and the kind of peace you can't buy. But apparently, my slice of heaven was about to become someone else's problem. Enter Karen Whitfield, age 52, real estate agent turned neighborhood tyrant. 8 months ago, she moved from Dallas to Cedar Falls after buying an $850,000 McMansion in Whispering Oaks Estates, the new subdivision that sprouted up next to my ranch like a subdivision-sized migraine. Within a week of closing, she was running for the HOA board. Within a month, she was president. Within 2 months, she was wielding that clipboard like it could summon the wrath of God. Picture a woman whose artificially blonde hair could survive a nuclear blast with an aggressive smile that screams, "I need to speak to your manager," from 3 counties away. She's always prowling around in athleisure outfits that cost more than most people's car payments, clutching that damn clipboard like her life depends on it. Her first violation notice appeared on my door 3 months after I moved in. My cattle were creating agricultural nuisances that threatened property values. Apparently, the smell of honest ranch work was more offensive than her personality, which is really saying something. Never mind that my family was raising cattle here when her neighborhood was still empty prairie. At first, I laughed it off. Had to be a mistake, right? Some city transplant who didn't understand small-town Texas. I figured a friendly conversation over sweet tea would sort everything out. That was my first mistake. Karen showed up the next week with her cousin Dale from County Code Enforcement, both armed with cameras and bad attitudes. They photographed everything: my manure pile, Grandpa's beloved 1974 tractor, even my chickens who looked personally offended by the attention. She kept mentioning she was researching her options for forcing compliance, and that's when the penny dropped. This wasn't confusion. This was war, and Karen Whitfield had just picked a fight with the wrong rancher. Karen didn't waste any time escalating things. 2 days after her little photography session, I found a thick manila envelope taped to my front door. Inside was the most official-looking cease and desist notice I'd ever seen outside of a federal courthouse. The letterhead claimed it was from Whitfield and Associates Legal Services, which I later discovered was Karen's kitchen table and a laser printer she bought at Costco. The document was a masterpiece of legal-sounding nonsense. It demanded immediate cessation of all agricultural operations on my property, citing health hazards, environmental concerns, and aesthetic violations. She'd even included a doctored survey map showing my ranch somehow encroaching on HOA territory. The audacity was breathtaking. But here's where it got interesting. The notice required me to attend an emergency compliance hearing at the Whispering Oaks Country Club, not a request to summons. Like I was some kind of criminal defendant instead of a property owner minding his own business on land I legally owned. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday night at 7 p.m., right when any decent rancher would be having dinner. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, inconvenienced me into submission. I showed up anyway, because sometimes you've got to see just how deep the crazy goes. The country club conference room reeked of industrial air freshener trying to mask the smell of old money and older prejudices. Karen had arranged the seating like a kangaroo court, 12 HOA board members sitting behind a long mahogany table like inquisitors, with a single metal folding chair facing them. Guess where I was supposed to sit? Karen presided over this theatrical production wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Agricultural Operations Impact on Community Standards, complete with dramatic photos of my property. My manure pile became biological hazard zone. My chickens were suddenly disease vectors. Even Grandpa's faithful old barn got labeled a structural eyesore. The coffee they served tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the Bush administration. The first one. "Mr. Stone," Karen announced, her voice bouncing off wood-paneled walls, "you've been called here tonight to address serious violations of our community covenants." I looked around at these people, mostly Dallas and Houston transplants who'd moved to small-town Texas for authentic rural charm, but wanted to bleach it clean first. "Ma'am," I said, settling into that uncomfortable chair, "I'd like to see a copy of these community covenants you keep referencing." The room's temperature dropped faster than a lead balloon. Karen's plastic smile flickered like a dying neon sign. "Those documents require legal review before distribution," she stammered, shuffling papers like she was hunting for buried treasure. "We can't just hand out proprietary information to outside parties." Outside parties. On land my family had owned since before most of these people knew Texas existed. Time for my counterpunch. I pulled out my federal credentials and slid the business card across that polished table like I was dealing poker. "Well, Karen, I spent 15 years writing housing regulations at HUD. Maybe I can help navigate those legal complexities you're worried about." You could have heard a mouse sneeze. Half the board suddenly discovered their shoes were fascinating, and Karen's face cycled through more colors than a traffic light having a seizure. Here's something most people don't know. HOAs must provide copies of all governing documents to any property owner within their claimed jurisdiction upon request. That's federal law under the Fair Housing Act. Refusing to provide them is actually evidence of discriminatory practices. The mini twist came when a nervous woman with kindness written in every line on her face raised her hand like she was asking permission to use the bathroom. "Karen," she said quietly, "didn't you tell us Mr. Stone was just some local rancher?" Karen's laugh could have shattered windows. "Anyone can print business cards these days, Beverly." But the damage was done. These weren't bad people, just misinformed ones. And now they were wondering what else their fearless leader had conveniently forgotten to mention. The meeting ended with Karen promising to provide appropriate documentation after proper consultation. Translation: she was frantically trying to figure out how deep a hole she'd dug. As everyone shuffled out, Beverly Chen, that nervous teacher, approached me in the parking lot. Night sounds filled the air around us. Crickets chirping, a distant owl calling, sounds that seemed infinitely more honest than anything that had happened inside. "Mr. Stone," she whispered, glancing around like she was planning a jailbreak. "Karen's been lying to us about everything. Your ranch, the legal authority, even the money." Her voice trembled. "I think she's planning something that could destroy this whole community." And that's how I found my first ally in what was about to become the HOA war of the century. Karen wasn't about to let my little credential reveal slow her down. If anything, it seemed to light a fire under her designer yoga pants. Within a week, she launched what I can only describe as bureaucratic warfare death by 1,000 paper cuts, executed with the precision of someone who'd clearly done this before. Monday morning brought Dale Whitfield, Karen's cousin, and the only county code enforcement officer who apparently didn't know better, rolling up my driveway in his official truck. The man looked about as comfortable as a cat in a thunderstorm, clutching a clipboard thick enough to stop bullets. Someone had filed complaints about unpermitted agricultural structures on my property. Every barn, shed, and fence post built since 1952 suddenly needed documentation that had mostly gone up in smoke during a barn fire 20 years ago. Tuesday delivered the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Some anonymous tipster real mystery there had reported potential groundwater contamination from my cattle operation. The inspector spent 4 hours taking soil samples and water measurements, his expression growing more annoyed by the minute as everything came back cleaner than a preacher's conscience. 70 years of sustainable ranching, but Karen apparently thought she could manufacture an environmental crisis out of thin air. Wednesday was my personal favorite. The state agriculture department rolled in to investigate reports of diseased livestock. The veterinarian they sent was a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Martinez, who took one look at my glossy-coated, healthy cattle and asked if this was somebody's idea of a joke. My cows were in better shape than half the people at the country club. The diesel fumes from all these government trucks were starting to make my place smell like a truck stop, and I was beginning to see the real strategy here. Karen wasn't trying to prove violations, she was trying to drown me in inspection fees, legal costs, and time wasted dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. Make compliance more expensive than surrender. I'd seen this tactic during my HUD days when unscrupulous developers wanted to clear out problematic residents. That's when Beverly Chen showed up at my ranch Thursday afternoon, her little Honda Civic kicking up dust clouds as she practically fishtailed into my driveway. The woman was shaking harder than a paint mixer, her coffee cup rattling against her wedding ring as she sat on my porch steps. My old dog Charlie wandered over to sniff her shoes, probably sensing her distress. "I haven't slept in 3 days," she said, watching Charlie with the kind of desperate attention people use when they're trying not to cry. "I keep thinking about what we've done to you, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell someone the truth." Beverly had brought presents, the kind that could land people in federal prison. Text messages, emails, bank statements, a paper trail that painted a picture uglier than Karen's attempt at natural-looking highlights. The whole HOA crusade wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about cold, hard cash. Sunset Holdings, the company developing Whispering Oaks, had been feeding Karen inside information about my property for months. They wanted my 40 acres for Phase 2 of their subdivision, and Karen was set to collect a $50,000 finder's fee plus first pick of the premium lots if she could force me to sell. The entire agricultural nuisance campaign was just theater designed to cover up what amounted to legal theft, but the real bombshell was in the HOA formation documents Beverly had smuggled out. As I read through the incorporation paperwork, I nearly spit coffee all over my kitchen table, not because it tasted bad, though it was strong enough to dissolve rust, but because of what those papers revealed. "Beverly," I said, setting down my mug with deliberate care, "do you have any idea what you just showed me?" She looked like she was about to throw up. "Something bad?" Back in my HUD days, I'd reviewed thousands of HOA formation documents. The requirements are crystal clear. Articles of incorporation filed with the state, covenants recorded with the county, proper legal establishment before any enforcement authority exists. Karen's HOA had skipped every single step. They were operating with about as much legal authority as my chickens. "Beverly, your HOA was never legally established," I said as gently as I could. "You've been operating as an illegal organization this entire time." The color drained from her face faster than water through a broken dam. "You mean everything we've done has no legal standing whatsoever," I finished. "Karen's been running a con game and she's used your community as unwitting accomplices." That evening brought another interesting development. Dr. Martinez called me back, her voice carrying that particular edge of someone who'd uncovered something nasty. "Mr. Stone, I did some checking after my visit today. Your Ms. Whitfield has filed similar livestock complaints in Tarrant, Collin, and Williamson counties over the past 2 years, always targeting rural properties adjacent to planned developments, always completely fabricated." My blood ran cold. Karen wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president having a midlife crisis. She was running a systematic scam across multiple counties, collecting finder's fees for forcing rural families off their land. How many other grandfathers' legacies had she destroyed with her manufactured crises and fake legal threats? That night, I sat in Grandpa's old leather recliner, surrounded by Beverly's evidence and my growing file on Karen's operation. Outside, coyotes were starting their evening chorus, mixing with the gentle sounds of cattle settling down for the night. Peaceful sounds that reminded me exactly why this land was worth every fight ahead. I was beginning to understand this wasn't just about saving my ranch anymore. Karen had turned harassment into a profitable business model, and there was no telling how many other families she'd already devastated with her systematic fraud. Time to make some phone calls to my old colleagues in Washington. If Karen wanted to play in the federal leagues, she was about to discover why you never pick fights with someone who helped write the rule book. The real war was just beginning. Karen must have sensed she was losing control, because her next move was straight out of the manipulation playbook: when you can't win on facts, manufacture a crisis, and control the narrative. Friday morning I woke up to find Channel 7 News parked in my driveway, their satellite truck blocking my cattle gate like they owned the place. The reporter, a perfectly coiffed woman who looked like she'd never been within 50 miles of actual livestock, was already filming her lead-in. I'm standing outside a controversial ranch operation that local residents say is threatening the health and safety of their children. I walked out with my morning coffee black, strong enough to wake the dead, and watched Karen orchestrate her little media circus. She'd gathered about a dozen neighbors, including several kids wearing surgical masks, like my cattle were breathing out anthrax instead of standard bovine exhalations. The morning air carried the honest smell of hay and manure, but Karen was waving her hands around like she was describing a toxic waste dump. This agricultural operation has been polluting our groundwater and creating unsanitary conditions for months, Karen told the camera, her voice dripping with practiced concern. We've tried reasoning with Mr. Stone, but he refuses to relocate his livestock to a more appropriate location. The reporter nodded sympathetically, apparently not bothered by the fact that more appropriate location was code for anywhere but here, so developers can steal his land. But here's where Karen's theatrical production started falling apart. The reporter, bless her heart, actually did some basic journalism. While Karen was busy staging photo ops with masked children, the news crew interviewed other neighbors, real neighbors, not Karen's carefully selected chorus. Old Pete Jameson, whose family had been friends with my grandfather since the Korean War, didn't mince words. That woman's been trying to run Garrett off his own land since the day she moved here. The Stone family's been good neighbors for 70 years, and now some city transplant thinks she can waltz in and change everything. Mrs. Rosa Martinez, who ran the local feed store, pointed out something Karen hadn't counted on. Mr. Stone buys all his supplies from us, pays his bills on time, and his cattle are some of the healthiest I've seen. If there were really problems, don't you think we'd know about it? By noon, Karen's media blitz was backfiring faster than a broken tractor. The reporter had discovered Karen's real estate connections, her finder's fee arrangement, and the fact that she'd been living in Cedar Falls for less than a year. The story that aired that evening wasn't about agricultural pollution. It was about a real estate agent trying to manipulate the media to force a land grab. But I wasn't content to just let Karen's credibility collapse on its own. It was time to start playing offense. I spent that weekend making phone calls to my old HUD colleagues, and let me tell you, 15 years of writing federal housing regulations creates some interesting friendships. When you've helped draft policies that affect millions of American homeowners, people remember you. More importantly, they trust you when you call in favors. By Monday morning, I'd filed formal complaints with 3 different federal agencies. The Fair Housing Act complaint went to HUD, alleging discrimination against agricultural lifestyle choices, something the department takes very seriously since rural harassment has become a nationwide problem. The real estate fraud complaint went to the Texas Real Estate Commission, detailing Karen's undisclosed conflicts of interest and systematic pattern of harassment for financial gain. But the big one, the one that would really get Karen's attention, went to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. When you use fake legal documents and government letterhead to threaten people, that's not just local mischief, that's federal crime territory. During my HUD years, I'd seen dozens of cases where local officials or real estate agents tried to force people off valuable land using manufactured legal crises. The pattern was always the same: create fake violations, pile on bureaucratic pressure, make compliance more expensive than selling, then swoop in with a generous offer from a developer. The feds call it theft by regulatory harassment, and they prosecute it aggressively because it undermines the entire concept of property rights. Meanwhile, Beverly was working her own magic inside the HOA. Turns out a retired third-grade teacher who'd spent 30 years managing classroom politics was surprisingly good at organizing a rebellion. By Tuesday night, she'd quietly approached every board member with evidence of Karen's fraud and the news that their organization had no legal standing whatsoever. The emergency board meeting that followed was apparently spectacular. Beverly recorded the whole thing on her phone, perfectly legal in Texas with single-party consent, and played me the highlights the next morning. You could hear Karen's voice getting shriller by the minute as board members demanded explanations for everything from the fake incorporation papers to her secret financial arrangements with Sunset Holdings. "This is a witch hunt," Karen screeched at one point, apparently unaware that witch hunts usually don't involve actual evidence of wrongdoing. By Wednesday, 3 board members had resigned rather than face potential criminal liability, and 2 others were demanding Karen's immediate removal as president. The HOA that had seemed so solid and threatening a week earlier was crumbling faster than a stale cookie. But Karen wasn't done yet. Thursday morning brought her most desperate move yet, a call to the county sheriff claiming I'd threatened her during a phone conversation that never happened. She wanted me arrested for harassment, apparently not realizing that filing false police reports is also a felony. Sheriff Bob Morrison had known my family for decades, and he showed up at my ranch with an expression somewhere between annoyed and apologetic. "Garrett, I got to ask you about this complaint, but between you and me, I think that woman's lost her damn mind." I showed him my phone records proving I'd never called Karen, my security camera footage showing I'd been on my property all week, and Beverly's recordings proving Karen was fabricating evidence. Sheriff Morrison listened to about 30 seconds of Karen's shrieking voice on Beverly's phone before shaking his head in disgust. "Son, I've seen plenty of crazy in my time, but this woman's operating on a whole different level," he said, tipping his hat as he headed back to his patrol car. "You just keep doing what you're doing, and let me know if she tries anything else stupid." That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint my grandfather's land in shades of gold and amber. The smell of sage and fresh grass filled the air, mixing with the distant sound of cattle settling down for the night. It was peaceful, beautiful, and worth every minute of this fight. Karen had played every card in her deck: legal intimidation, bureaucratic harassment, media manipulation, and now false police reports. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd assumed she was dealing with just another rural victim who didn't know his rights. Tomorrow, she was going to discover what happens when you try to steal from someone who helped write the federal rulebook on housing discrimination, and I had a feeling it was going to be educational for everyone involved. Saturday morning brought Beverly Chen to my ranch again, but this time she wasn't shaking with fear, she was practically vibrating with righteous fury. She'd brought a banker's box full of documents that she dropped on my kitchen table with the satisfaction of someone delivering a smoking gun. "Garrett, you need to see this," she said, pulling out manila folders thick with financial records. "Karen made one mistake. She trusted me to handle the HOA bookkeeping because I used to be a teacher, and teachers are good with numbers." What Beverly had discovered would have made a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Karen hadn't just been lying about HOA authority and manufacturing fake violations, she'd been embezzling community funds to pay for her harassment campaign against me. Pool maintenance fees diverted to legal costs, landscaping budgets redirected to private investigators. Even the community Christmas party fund had been raided to pay for those fake government documents. "Look at this," Beverly said, pointing to a bank statement with the trembling finger of someone who'd discovered their trusted leader was a common thief. She's stolen over $127,000 from the community fund in the past 8 months. But that wasn't even the best part. Karen's house, that $850,000 McMansion she'd been lording over everyone, wasn't actually hers. The deed was in the name of Sunset Holdings, the same development company that was paying her to force me off my land. She was living in a developer-financed showcase home, playing the part of a successful homeowner while secretly working to destroy the community she pretended to represent. "She never bought anything," Beverly continued, her voice getting stronger as her teacher instincts kicked in. "It's all smoke and mirrors. The house, the authority, the legal threats. She's been running a complete fraud from day one. The insurance claims were the final nail in Karen's coffin. She'd filed over $30,000 in fake claims for property damage caused by adjacent agricultural operations, meaning she was billing my ranch for imaginary harm to community property. Damaged sprinkler systems from airborne contaminants, landscaping destruction from invasive agricultural runoff, paint damage from chemical drift that somehow never left any actual evidence. But Beverly had saved the best revelation for last. Hidden in Karen's email correspondence was the smoking gun that connected everything. A systematic pattern of targeting rural properties across Texas for developer acquisition. She'd been running the same scam in multiple counties, using different HOAs as cover for what amounted to organized theft. There are at least 6 other families, Beverly said, her voice breaking slightly. 6 other properties she's helped steal using the same playbook. Fake violations, bureaucratic harassment, manufactured crises, then swooping in with lowball offers when the families can't afford to fight anymore. The financial trail painted a picture of industrial-scale corruption. Karen had been collecting finder's fees ranging from $25,000 to $50,000 per property, plus getting first pick of premium lots in each new development. She'd turned rural land theft into a profitable business model, and my ranch was just her latest target. What hit me hardest was realizing how many families had already lost their generational land because they didn't know their rights or couldn't afford the legal fight. Grandfather's ranch, generational farms, family homesteads, all sacrificed to Karen's greed and some developers' expansion plans. "Beverly," I said, looking at this mountain of evidence, "do you understand what you've just handed me?" She nodded grimly. Enough to put her in federal prison for a very long time. The power dynamic had just shifted completely. Karen thought she was playing games with some rural rube who'd roll over when pressured. Instead, she'd targeted someone with federal connections, 15 years of regulatory experience, and now a paper trail documenting systematic fraud across multiple jurisdictions. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice for all those families who'd already lost their land, and protection for the ones Karen hadn't targeted yet. She'd made harassment and theft into a business model, and that business was about to get shut down permanently. I sat back in Grandpa's old kitchen chair, surrounded by evidence of corruption that reached far beyond my little corner of Texas. The morning sun was streaming through windows that had watched 3 generations of Stones drink their coffee and plan their days. This land had survived the Depression, 2 wars, droughts, floods, and now it was going to survive Karen Whitfield. But first, it was time to make some very interesting phone calls to federal agencies that take systematic housing fraud very seriously. Karen had picked the wrong fight with the wrong person, and she was about to discover that some battles have consequences that last a lifetime. The war was about to become a rout. Sunday morning, my ranch house looked like a war room. Beverly had recruited 2 more HOA board members who'd grown tired of Karen's tyranny: Jim Patterson, a retired electrician with a methodical mind, and Maria Santos, a paralegal who knew her way around legal documents. The kitchen table was covered with evidence folders, legal pads, and enough coffee cups to caffeinate a small army. The smell of fresh brewed coffee mixed with the righteous anger of people who'd discovered they'd been played. And let me tell you, there's nothing quite like the focused fury of honest folks who've had enough of being lied to. "All right," I said, spreading Beverly's financial records across the table like battle plans. "We've got 3 objectives here. First, stop Karen from destroying any more families. Second, get justice for the people she's already hurt. Third, make sure this never happens again in Cedar Falls or anywhere else." Jim leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd finally found the right tool for a stubborn job. "What do you need from us?" The legal strategy was straightforward, but required precision timing. I'd already contacted Jim Rodriguez, a lawyer in town whose grandfather had bought cattle from mine back in the day. Jim practiced mostly real estate law, but he'd agreed to help pro bono once I explained what Karen was really up to. More importantly, he had connections with the state attorney general's office and knew how to coordinate with federal investigations. The financial approach was where Beverly's teaching background proved invaluable. She documented every fraudulent transaction with the thoroughness of someone grading papers, creating a paper trail that would make forensic accountants weep with joy. We needed to freeze the HOA accounts before Karen could transfer or destroy any more evidence, which meant emergency court injunctions and coordinating with multiple banks. But the most important element was the public relations campaign. Karen had been controlling the narrative by keeping her victims isolated and ashamed. Time to flip that script and show the whole community what they were really dealing with. Here's something most people don't realize, I explained, pulling out my old HUD training materials. When someone commits systematic housing fraud, they're not just stealing from individuals, they're undermining the entire concept of property rights. Federal agencies have specific task forces dedicated to this kind of organized theft, and they prosecute it under RICO statutes when there's a pattern of criminal enterprise. The RICO angle was crucial because it allowed prosecutors to go after everyone involved in the conspiracy, from Karen herself to the developers paying her finder's fees. More importantly, RICO cases carry mandatory asset forfeiture, which meant we could potentially recover stolen funds for all her victims, not just the ones in Cedar Falls. Maria had been quietly taking notes with the precision of someone who'd spent years preparing legal briefs. What about statute of limitations? Some of these other properties were stolen over a year ago. Housing discrimination cases have a 2-year statute under federal law, I said, but fraud has no limitations if the scheme is ongoing, which it obviously is, since she's still actively targeting my ranch. We spent the next hour dividing responsibilities. Beverly would continue documenting financial crimes and secretly recording Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. Jim would coordinate with other HOA board members to formally remove Karen from any position of authority and dissolve the fraudulent organization. Maria would help Jim Rodriguez prepare emergency court filings to freeze assets and prevent Karen from fleeing or destroying evidence. My job was the most delicate, coordinating with federal agencies without tipping off Karen that her entire operation was under investigation. During my HUD years, I'd learned that premature disclosure of federal involvement often caused targets to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We needed Karen to keep digging her hole deeper while we built an ironclad case. The beauty of having inside knowledge of federal housing investigations was understanding exactly which agencies had jurisdiction and how to present evidence in ways that triggered immediate action. Fair housing violations went to HUD, but systematic fraud crossed into FBI territory, especially when it involved wire fraud and mail fraud across state lines. The IRS would be interested in Karen's unreported finder's fees, and the state attorney general could coordinate with federal authorities on the RICO prosecution. One more thing, I said, pulling out a legal pad covered with phone numbers. We're going to need to contact Karen's other victims and get them involved in this investigation. They deserve justice. But more importantly, their testimony will establish the pattern of criminal behavior we need for federal prosecution. Beverly looked troubled. What if they're too scared to come forward? Karen destroyed their lives once already. That's where my federal connections come in handy, I said. Witness protection programs, victim compensation funds, legal assistance. The feds have resources most people never hear about. These families don't have to face Karen alone anymore. And by noon, we had our battle plan mapped out with military precision. Phase 1 involved secretly coordinating with law enforcement while continuing to gather evidence. Phase 2 would be simultaneous legal strikes, criminal complaints, civil lawsuits, emergency injunctions, and asset freezes. Phase 3 was the public exposure that would destroy Karen's ability to operate anywhere in Texas. The timeline was critical. Too fast, and Karen might destroy evidence or flee. Too slow, and she might target additional families or transfer stolen funds beyond recovery. We needed everything coordinated perfectly. Federal agents, state prosecutors, local law enforcement, media investigation, and civil litigation all moving together like a well-oiled machine. Jim Rodriguez had agreed to file preliminary injunctions by Tuesday to freeze Karen's assets and prevent her from accessing HOA funds. Beverly would present the board with evidence of embezzlement at Wednesday's emergency meeting, officially removing Karen from any authority. Maria would coordinate with the state attorney general's office to begin criminal proceedings. Meanwhile, I'd be making very specific phone calls to very specific people in Washington who specialized in exactly this type of systematic fraud. Karen had turned rural land theft into a business model, but she was about to discover that some businesses have federal regulators who take their jobs very seriously. The irony was beautiful. Karen had targeted me because she thought I was just another rural victim who didn't know his rights. Instead, she'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent 15 years creating the very federal programs designed to stop people like her. Wednesday afternoon, we'd know whether Karen was smart enough to surrender quietly or foolish enough to keep fighting a battle she'd already lost. Either way, the families she'd already destroyed were going to get justice, and her systematic theft operation was going to end permanently. Time to show Ms. Whitfield what federal regulations looked like from the wrong side. Karen must have sensed the walls closing in because Monday brought a level of desperation I hadn't expected even from her. She'd hired a private investigator, some sleazy character named Rick, who looked like he'd learned his trade watching too many detective shows to dig up dirt on my federal career. Apparently, she thought she could find some scandal that would discredit me before I could expose her operation. What she found instead was 15 years of spotless service records, commendations from 3 different HUD secretaries, and testimony from grateful families whose housing discrimination cases I'd helped resolve. Rick the P. I looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized he'd been hired to investigate someone whose biggest scandal was getting a parking ticket in 2019. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. Tuesday brought a pathetic attempt to poison my relationships with county officials by spreading rumors that I'd been taking bribes during my federal service. She actually called Commissioner Williams, whose family had known mine for 3 generations, to suggest that my grandfather's ranch was somehow purchased with dirty government money. Commissioner Williams called me that afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Garrett, that woman just asked me if I thought your granddaddy was a federal criminal. I told her Joe Stone was the most honest man in 3 counties, and if she kept spreading lies about dead war veterans, I'd personally make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person she really was." The smell of desperation was getting stronger than Karen's vanilla perfume, and it was about to get a lot worse for her. Wednesday night brought her most brazen act yet. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of spray paint cans rattling near my front fence. My security cameras installed after Karen's first harassment incident captured everything in crystal clear night vision. Karen and some accomplice in dark clothing were vandalizing my property with bright red graffiti, health hazard and toxic waste dump, painted across the fence boards that had stood for decades. The audio picked up their conversation too, and it was pure gold. Karen's voice, unmistakable even in whispers, discussing how the vandalism would provide visual evidence for her insurance claims and media interviews. She was literally manufacturing the property damage she'd been claiming my ranch was causing to her precious subdivision. But the real prize came Thursday morning when Karen filed false police reports claiming I'd threatened her during phone calls that never happened. She provided Sheriff Morrison with transcripts of conversations that were pure fiction, complete with threats that sounded like dialogue from a bad action movie. Sheriff Morrison showed up at my ranch with an expression somewhere between professional duty and personal annoyance. "Garrett, I got to ask you about these alleged phone calls, but I already checked your phone records against the times she's claiming, and unless you've figured out how to be in 2 places at once, this woman's lying through her teeth." I showed him my security footage of Karen vandalizing my property just hours earlier, along with Beverly's recordings of HOA meetings where Karen discussed final solutions for the ranch problem. Sheriff Morrison watched about 30 seconds of Karen spray painting my fence before shaking his head in disgust. "That woman's committed more crimes this week than most people do in a lifetime," he said, downloading copies of the security footage onto his department laptop. "Filing false police reports, vandalism, conspiracy to commit fraud, she's going to be real popular at the county jail." But I asked him to hold off on arrests for just a few more days. My federal colleagues needed Karen to remain free long enough to document the full scope of her operation, and premature local charges might interfere with the larger investigation. Meanwhile, Beverly was working her own kind of magic inside what remained of the HOA board. Thursday's emergency meeting, secretly recorded of course, was apparently a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Karen showed up expecting to rally support for her latest crisis narrative, only to find herself facing a room full of people who'd finally seen through her lies. She walked in wearing that navy blazer like she was addressing the United Nations, Beverly told me later, her voice still trembling with leftover adrenaline. Started talking about escalated security threats and the need for enhanced protective measures against your ranch. Then Jim Patterson just stood up and asked her to explain the missing $127,000. According to Beverly's recording, Karen's response was a thing of beauty. First came denial. She didn't know anything about missing money. Then deflection. Beverly must have made accounting errors. Finally, desperate attacks. Everyone was conspiring against her because they were jealous of her leadership success. The coup de grace came when Maria Santos asked Karen to provide proof of HOA incorporation and legal authority. Karen's response was to demand that board members stop undermining her authority and trust her leadership during these difficult times. That's when Jim Patterson played your recording explaining that we'd never been legally incorporated, Beverly continued. You should have seen her face when she realized everyone knew she'd been running an illegal organization from day one. By Friday morning, the fraudulent HOA had officially dissolved itself, with the remaining board members voting unanimously to remove Karen from any position of authority and begin criminal referrals to appropriate agencies. Karen's response was to send threatening emails to every board member, promising lawsuits and consequences for their betrayal. Those emails were forwarded to Sheriff Morrison within an hour, adding witness intimidation and threats to Karen's growing list of criminal charges. The woman was self-destructing faster than a fireworks factory explosion, and every desperate move just provided more evidence for federal prosecutors. Friday evening brought the most telling sign yet that Karen knew her operation was falling apart. Rick the P. I showed up at my ranch looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth, offering to sell information about his client in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Apparently, Karen had asked him to plant evidence on my property drugs, stolen goods, anything that might justify a search warrant and property seizure. Rick had refused, but he'd recorded the conversation where Karen offered him $10,000 to find something that would stick. Another federal crime to add to her growing collection, and more proof that her harassment campaign was systematic and premeditated. That night, I sat on my porch, listening to the peaceful sounds of cattle settling down and coyotes beginning their evening songs. The air smelled like sage and fresh grass, clean and honest. Nothing like the toxic atmosphere Karen had tried to create with her lies and manufactured crises. Karen had escalated from legal intimidation to media manipulation to outright vandalism and false police reports. She'd tried everything in her playbook, but every desperate move just provided more evidence of systematic fraud and harassment. Monday morning, she was going to discover what happens when all that evidence gets presented to federal agencies that specialize in prosecuting exactly this kind of organized criminal enterprise. And I had a feeling it was going to be educational for everyone involved. The end game was about to begin. Karen's final gambit was so audacious it actually impressed me in the same way you might admire a tornado for its sheer destructive creativity. Monday morning brought what appeared to be federal agents to my door, complete with official-looking badges, government-issued windbreakers, and an emergency health department closure order that looked authentic enough to fool most people. The lead agent was a middle-aged man with the kind of cheap suit and nervous energy that screamed actor between gigs. His partner looked like she'd gotten her federal training from YouTube videos. They showed me documents with impressive seals claiming the ranch posed an immediate public health emergency that required evacuation of all livestock within 24 hours. Mr. Stone, the fake agent announced, reading from a script that would have been rejected by community theater, this property has been determined to pose a significant risk to community health and safety. You have 24 hours to relocate all agricultural operations or face federal prosecution. The paperwork was beautiful forged government seals, official-looking letterheads, even fake EPA registration numbers. Karen had put real effort into this production, hiring actors and commissioning professional-quality fraudulent documents. She was committing multiple federal felonies just to maintain her ridiculous charade. But here's the thing about spending 15 years writing federal regulations. You know what real government documents look like, how actual federal agents behave, and which agencies have jurisdiction over what. These clowns were about as authentic as a $3 bill. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm while my security cameras recorded everything, "could you explain which specific federal statute gives EPA authority to close privately owned agricultural operations?" The lead actor shuffled through his fake papers like a student who hadn't studied for the exam. "Under the, Federal Emergency Health Protection Act." "There is no Federal Emergency Health Protection Act. I should know. I helped write half the housing and environmental regulations these people were supposedly enforcing." "And could you provide your federal credentials for verification?" I continued, pulling out my phone like I was going to make calls. Both actors started sweating harder than manual laborers in August. The woman kept glancing at her partner with the desperation of someone who'd realized they were in way over their heads. "Mr. Stone, we don't have time for bureaucratic delays," the male actor said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is a public health emergency requiring immediate action." Meanwhile, real federal agents were watching this entire performance from concealed positions around my property. My Friday phone calls to Washington had triggered a multi-agency task force investigation, and they'd been monitoring Karen's activities since Saturday. The fake federal raid was being recorded by actual federal agents, who were probably wondering if criminals had always been this stupid. I decided to have some fun with Karen's theatrical production. "Well, if this is really a federal emergency, I should probably contact my old colleagues at HUD to coordinate the response. Let me just call Assistant Secretary Johnson." The panic in both actors' eyes was beautiful. They started backing toward their rented car faster than retreat from a fire ant hill. "Actually, Mr. Stone, we might have made an error in our paperwork," the woman stammered. "We should probably return to headquarters for clarification." "Oh, don't leave on my account," I said cheerfully. "I'm sure my federal contacts would love to meet you and discuss proper emergency response protocols." They were in their car and kicking up gravel within 30 seconds, probably wondering how much jail time you get for impersonating federal agents. But Karen wasn't done with her performance. Within an hour, she was posting on social media about her successful federal intervention, complete with staged photos of my ranch supposedly being evacuated by government order. She'd filmed the actors delivering their fake documents and was using the footage as proof that her harassment campaign had been vindicated by federal authorities. The Facebook post was pure Karen. Victory! Federal agents have finally taken action against the agricultural nuisance threatening our community. Property values protected. Our children are safe. Sometimes it takes real leadership to get results. She was celebrating a federal crime as a personal triumph, apparently unaware that real federal agents were documenting every word for her eventual prosecution. That afternoon brought Beverly to my ranch with recordings from an emergency HOA meeting where Karen had presented her federal victory to remaining residents. According to Beverly, Karen had shown the footage of fake agents and claimed she'd personally coordinated with Washington to protect the community. "She's completely lost touch with reality," Beverly said, her voice mixing amazement with genuine concern. "She actually believes her own lies at this point. She's telling people she's been working undercover with federal authorities for months to build a case against your ranch." The recordings were devastating. Karen claiming she had high-level contacts in federal agencies, describing non-existent meetings with government officials, even inventing conversations with senators about the Cedar Falls agricultural crisis. Every word was another count of fraud and another piece of evidence for federal prosecutors. But the real catastrophe came that evening when Karen tried to force compliance with her fake federal order. She showed up at my ranch with her cousin Dale and 2 other men, claiming they were there to assist with the voluntary livestock evacuation as ordered by federal authorities. My security system captured everything in HD, Karen directing her accomplices to open cattle gates, her voice clearly audible as she instructed them to help the federal process along by releasing my cattle onto public roads. She was attempting livestock theft while claiming it was federal law enforcement. That's when Sheriff Morrison arrived with backup units, apparently having received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at my ranch. The sight of law enforcement vehicles sent Karen's accomplices scattering like cockroaches when the lights come on, leaving her standing alone next to my cattle gate with the expression of someone who'd just realized they were caught red-handed. "Karen Whitfield," Sheriff Morrison announced, stepping out of his patrol car with the weary satisfaction of someone finally ending a long-running problem. "You're under arrest for criminal conspiracy, livestock theft, impersonating federal agents, and about 6 other felonies we're still counting up." The handcuffs clicking shut on Karen's wrists had the most beautiful sound like justice finally being served with a side of cosmic irony. She'd spent months trying to have me arrested on fake charges, and now she was going to jail for very real crimes that she'd committed in full view of multiple cameras. As Sheriff Morrison read her rights, Karen kept screaming about federal authority and government conspiracies, apparently still believing her own fabricated narrative even as it collapsed around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. That night, I sat on my porch, listening to my cattle settling down peacefully in their pastures, the sound of coyotes calling across land that had survived another assault on its integrity. The air smelled clean and honest, free from the toxic atmosphere Karen had tried to create with her systematic campaign of lies and harassment. Karen had played every card in her deck: legal intimidation, bureaucratic warfare, media manipulation, false police reports, property vandalism, and finally outright fraud using fake federal agents. But every desperate escalation had just provided more evidence for the federal case that was about to destroy her criminal enterprise permanently. Tomorrow would bring the public confrontation that ended this nightmare once and for all. And I had a feeling Karen Whitfield was about to discover that some battles have consequences that last a lifetime. Tuesday evening brought the performance of Karen's lifetime, a town hall meeting she'd called to celebrate the federal resolution of the agricultural crisis. The Cedar Falls Community Center was packed wall to wall with residents, local media, and what Karen didn't know were federal agents positioned throughout the crowd like pieces on a chessboard. Karen had been released on bond that morning, apparently convinced that her arrest was just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up once everyone understood her coordination with federal authorities. The woman's capacity for self-delusion was truly impressive. She'd turned criminal charges into validation of her leadership. The community center smelled like industrial coffee and nervous energy, with folding chairs arranged theater-style facing a small stage where Karen had set up another PowerPoint presentation. She'd dressed for the occasion in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, carrying herself like a conquering hero returning from battle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice echoing off the cinder-block walls with the confidence of someone who believed her own press releases. "I called this meeting tonight to share some wonderful news about protecting our community's future." She clicked to her first slide. "Federal intervention success story" in bold letters over a photo of my ranch. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Through persistent advocacy and coordination with federal authorities, we've successfully addressed the agricultural nuisance that threatened our property values and children's health," Karen announced, apparently oblivious to the fact that half the audience was law enforcement. That's when Beverly Chen stood up in the middle of the crowd. "Karen, could you explain why you were arrested yesterday for conspiracy and fraud?" The temperature in that room dropped about 20 degrees. Karen's plastic smile flickered like a dying light bulb, but she pressed on with the desperation of someone trying to outrun an avalanche. "That was simply a bureaucratic misunderstanding," Karen said, her voice getting slightly shrill. "Sometimes federal operations require discretion that local authorities don't fully understand." Beverly wasn't done. "Could you also explain the $127,000 you stole from community funds?" A murmur ran through the crowd like electricity through water. Karen's face cycled through more colors than a sunset, but she kept trying to maintain control of her narrative. "Those were legitimate operational expenses related to protecting community interests," she stammered. "Legal fees, investigation costs, federal coordination." That's when I stood up in the back of the room. The entire crowd turned to look at me, and Karen's expression went from confident to terrified in about half a second. "Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room, "would you like to explain to everyone here about your finder's fee arrangement with Sunset Holdings?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She'd been caught completely off guard, apparently not expecting me to show up at her victory celebration. I don't know what you're talking about," she managed to say. I started walking toward the front of the room, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. "How about we discuss the 6 other families whose land you've helped steal using this same playbook? The fake HOA authority, the forged government documents." Karen was backing away from the microphone like it had turned into a snake. You're just trying to discredit me because you know I've exposed your illegal operation." "Karen," I said, reaching the stage and taking the microphone from her trembling hands, "there's something these good people need to know about their HOA president." I clicked to the next slide in her presentation, but instead of her prepared materials, Beverly had loaded the real evidence: bank records showing embezzlement, text messages proving the conspiracy with developers, photos of Karen vandalizing my property, audio recordings of her hiring fake federal agents. The crowd's reaction was like watching a wave break: gasps, angry murmurs, people turning to their neighbors with expressions of shock and betrayal. These folks had trusted Karen with their community, their money, and their children's future, only to discover she'd been robbing them blind while working for developers who wanted to destroy everything they'd built. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, "Karen Whitfield isn't your HOA president. She's a professional con artist who's been running systematic fraud operations across Texas, stealing rural land for developers and collecting finder's fees for destroying families like mine. That's when Special Agent Martinez of the FBI stood up in the crowd. Karen Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The community center erupted, flashbulbs going off as reporters documented Karen's second arrest in 2 days. Federal agents moving through the crowd to coordinate with local law enforcement. Residents demanding answers about their stolen money and fraudulent HOA. Karen's final moment came when Agent Martinez read her rights in front of the entire community she'd been deceiving. No more fake federal authority, no more manufactured crises, no more clipboard-wielding and designer outfits, just handcuffs and the walk of shame past neighbors who'd finally seen through her lies. "This is a conspiracy!" Karen screamed as they led her toward the door. "He's got connections. He's corrupt. This is all about protecting his illegal operation." Agent Martinez paused at the door and turned back to the crowd. For the record, Mr. Stone's ranch has been inspected by multiple agencies and found to be in complete compliance with all federal, state, and local regulations. Ms. Whitfield has been under federal investigation for systematic housing fraud affecting multiple counties. The silence that followed was broken by old Pete Jameson, whose family had known mine for 3 generations. "Garrett," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of community judgment, "we owe you an apology. That woman damn near destroyed this town with her lies." But the most satisfying moment came from Beverly Chen, who stepped up to the microphone as Karen was led away in handcuffs. "I want everyone here to know that Garrett Stone saved our community, not just his ranch, all of us. He could have handled this quietly, but instead he made sure we learned the truth about what was happening to our neighbors." As the crowd filed out into the Texas evening, you could hear conversations starting, people comparing notes about Karen's lies, discussing how to rebuild their community association legitimately, making plans to support other families who'd been victimized by similar scams. The smell of sage and mesquite drifted through the open doors of the community center, mixing with the honest conversations of neighbors who'd rediscovered what real community leadership looked like. Karen Whitfield's reign of fraud was over, and justice was finally being served with the full weight of federal law enforcement behind it. But more importantly, a community had learned to recognize and resist the kind of systematic corruption that destroys rural families and steals generational land. The war was over. Truth had won. And Karen was going to have plenty of time in federal prison to think about why you should never pick fights with people who know how to use the system properly. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my grandfather's porch watching the sunrise paint 40 acres of Texas land in shades of gold that no developer will ever touch. The morning coffee tastes like victory mixed with the satisfaction of a job well done, and the air carries nothing but the honest smells of cattle, sage, and freedom. Karen Whitfield is currently serving 15 to 20 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to a laundry list of charges that read like a criminal law textbook: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, impersonating federal officers, and my personal favorite violation of the RICO Act for operating a systematic criminal enterprise. Turns out the federal government takes a very dim view of people who turn land theft into a business model. The financial recovery was everything we'd hoped for, and more. Federal asset forfeiture netted over $2 million in stolen funds and illegally obtained property, which was distributed among Karen's victims across multiple counties. The families she'd already destroyed got their money back, plus damages for the hell she'd put them through. Justice served with the side of actual compensation. Sunset Holdings, the development company that had been financing Karen's operation, lost their federal contracts worth over $200 million and filed for bankruptcy within 3 months. Apparently, systematic housing fraud isn't great for maintaining government relationships. The executives are facing their own federal charges, and their entire Texas operation has been shut down permanently. But the real victory is what happened to our community. The residents of former Whispering Oaks estates, now calling themselves Cedar Falls neighbors, formed a legitimate homeowner association with actual legal standing, proper incorporation papers, and transparent financial management. Beverly Chen serves as their first elected president, bringing the same methodical approach to community leadership that she once used to manage third-grade classrooms. Property values in the area have actually increased since Karen's removal, probably because buyers aren't worried about purchasing homes in a community run by criminals. Turns out legitimate governance is better for real estate prices than systematic fraud. Who could have predicted that? The ranch itself has never been healthier. My cattle are thriving, the land is producing better than it has in decades, and I've started offering educational tours to urban families who want their children to understand where food actually comes from. There's something deeply satisfying about watching city kids discover that milk doesn't spontaneously appear in grocery stores. I used my settlement money from Karen's harassment lawsuit to establish the Garrett Stone Community Defense Foundation, which provides free legal assistance to rural families facing systematic harassment from corrupt HOAs or developers. We've already helped over 30 families fight back against similar scams, and our success rate is 100%. Turns out most bullies fold when their victims have competent legal representation. The foundation also funds educational programs teaching homeowners about their rights, proper HOA governance, and how to recognize and report systematic fraud. Knowledge is power, and ignorance is what allows predators like Karen to operate. We're making sure future scammers find a lot fewer easy targets. Dr. Martinez from the Agriculture Department has become a regular visitor, bringing veterinary students to study sustainable ranching practices on land that's been managed responsibly for 3 generations. She says my operation is a model for how agriculture and development can coexist without destroying rural communities or family legacies. Sheriff Morrison stops by every few weeks for coffee and updates on community happenings. He's still shaking his head over Karen's spectacular self-destruction, though he admits it was the most entertaining criminal investigation of his career. Never seen someone work so hard to provide evidence for their own prosecution, he told me last week. Beverly has become something of a local hero, speaking at county meetings about recognizing and preventing HOA fraud. Her experience dismantling Karen's operation from the inside has made her an expert on governance corruption, and she's helped reform multiple associations across East Texas. Turns out retired teachers make excellent community organizers when they're properly motivated. The most satisfying development came last month when the state legislature passed the Rural Family Protection Act legislation I helped draft that strengthens penalties for systematic housing fraud and provides additional resources for victims of land theft schemes. Karen's criminal enterprise inadvertently became the catalyst for statewide legal reforms that will protect thousands of families from similar attacks. But perhaps the best outcome is the simplest one. I get to drink my morning coffee on land that's been in my family for 70 years, listening to cattle lowing and meadowlarks singing, breathing air that smells like sage and honest work. Grandfather's legacy survived another assault, and it'll be here for another 70 years at least. The irony is beautiful. Karen thought she was targeting some helpless rural rube who didn't know his rights. Instead, she picked a fight with someone who'd spent 15 years writing the federal regulations designed to stop people exactly like her. Her systematic harassment campaign became a masterclass in why bullies should always research their targets before declaring war. As I watch the sun rise over land that will never be developed, never be stolen, and never be threatened by clipboard-wielding con artists again, I'm reminded of something Grandfather wrote in his journal. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, but if you're fighting for the right reasons, with the right knowledge, you'll usually win. Karen Whitfield discovered that lesson the hard way, and her federal prison cell gives her plenty of time to think about it. Now, I want to hear from you folks. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare stories. You might be surprised how many rights you actually have that you never knew about. And if you're dealing with systematic harassment like what Karen put me through, don't suffer in silence. There are federal resources available to help, and sometimes all it takes is one phone call to the right agency to turn the tables completely. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because unfortunately there are plenty more Karens out there who need to learn these same lessons. And trust me, those stories are coming. Remember